All right, we get into the 1980s today. The 1980s is quite a different period from the 1970s in America. You have only two presidents, and they had very similar ways of thinking and similar ways of running the country. And so today we get into the 1980s. 1980s is also when the Cold War, well, actually 1991, is when the Cold War officially ends between the USA and Russia. All right, the 1980s. Our objectives: explain Ronald Reagan's economic policies and describe important international events in the 1980s and 1990s, especially the end of the Cold War and the Persian Gulf War. All right, Reagan becomes president in 1980. The late 1970s were kind of disappointing for Americans. The economy was not in good shape. They weren't very satisfied with Jimmy Carter. And so they wanted something new, and Reagan was just that. He used to be an actor, and then he became president. So in 1980, he has the view that the government is the problem. We need less government, less taxes, and that's how we're going to kind of fix our economy. So he wanted to have less programs for people to be dependent on. So if the government could spend less money on things like welfare, Social Security, stuff like that, he thought the country would be in better shape. During his presidency, 20 million jobs were created for people. He removed a bunch of rules about businesses, what they could or couldn't do. And what this helped them do is to kind of make a little bit more money, and then they could hire more people. So that's where a lot of the jobs came from. This was known as trickle-down economics. He gave breaks to the very rich and the big companies. That way, the big companies had more money, and they then would spend that money on employees and different things like that. Deregulation is what this is known as. This helped slow down the country's inflation, so our currency didn't become as devalued as quickly. Here's his election map. Pretty dominant against Carter. Not as dominant, though, as the 84 election, where he gets all but 13 electoral votes, just Washington, D.C. and Minnesota. Every other state chose Reagan as their president. He was a very popular president. During Reagan's administration, we spent lots more on military. You can see the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War, and here is Reagan's Cold War push. He wanted to kind of dominate the Cold War with our building up our weapons and stuff against Russia. And that was in his mind to keep us safe, but also to kind of put Russia out of business. Reagan knew that Russia would not be able to keep up with our spending. And so they could either A, keep spending and then they'd kind of run out of money, or B, they'd have to slow down and we would just be more dominant than they would. So this left us with a large deficit, however. The government, we spent more money on things like military than we did collect in taxes. Some international events during the 80s. Soviet Union was in huge economic trouble. They kept spending, kind of like how we did. And eventually, they couldn't sustain it. They couldn't provide enough jobs for their people. There wasn't enough goods, wasn't enough places to live. And so they had trouble keeping up with America. Gorbachev, he became the leader in 85. And when he took over, him and Reagan started to build a good relationship. The Cold War eventually ends with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, you can see there. Gorbachev and Reagan, they met lots and lots of times. And in 1987, they signed a treaty to limit the number of nuclear weapons each country had. Then, in 1988, George Bush, he became president. He was the vice president of Reagan. And during his presidency, the Soviet Union falls apart. The government becomes so weak that you had large groups of people that started to protest, and then basically all of Eastern Europe, they fell from power, and Russia didn't really have control over them anymore. Berlin Wall crashes down in 1991, and the Soviet Union With them collapsing, the Cold War is then over. Here is George Bush Sr. This is his electoral map. So very popular since he was Reagan's vice president. Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein, you probably have heard of him, he was the leader of Iraq. And in 1990, he invaded Kuwait. And we did not like that. He wanted to capture their oil fields because Iraq was big into the oil business. And Bush decides that other countries from the United Nations, he thinks that they should start something called a coalition, so a group of allies to stop Iraq from taking over these small countries. And so in 1991, the US led this coalition against Iraq. And this was the Persian Gulf War. It lasts about 7 weeks, all new weapons that warfare had never really seen before. Coalition was won quickly. We used all those highly trained soldiers and weapons. Summary. Reagan increased military spending and created a large deficit. During Bush's presidency, the Cold War ended, and that's it. All right, that is all for the 1980s. Tomorrow we get into the 1990s.